All right, this part of the video is going to go over how the war on Asia went. So first, Japan's massive territorial expansion and then contraction. In Asia, the war dates back to 1931 and was fought on a full-scale basis since 1937 Japanese attack um, when the Japanese attack Nanking. So the Japanese were really overtaking Asia quite quickly, but then they decided to change their strategy and attack the United States directly. And the reason for this, and we'll be seeing this in class, is that the United States and the Europeans had an oil embargo on the Japanese, and they saw this as an act of war, basically, from the Japanese perspective. And so, because of that, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and on the 7th of December in 1941. And this was actually very similar to what Hitler did, in that what the Japanese mistake here was to bring in an industrial power to the war whose industrial capacity they could not match. So what I mean by that is that there was no way that the Japanese could ever produce as much industrial might as the Americans did. Similarly, there was no way that the Germans could ever produce as much as the Soviet Union combined with the United States could. So this and in tangent, so until 1942 in the Battle of Midway, Japan is just taking over territory, taking over territory, taking over territory. But with the code breaking operation of Operation Magic, the Allies discovered the Japanese, or the United States discovered the Japanese plan. They broke the Japanese radio code, and the Japanese could not break the American radio codes. Part of this is because they were using some of the codes were in the Navajo language. So this is a turning point. Like the United States figures out exactly what the Japanese are doing, and they're able to crush the Japanese forces, and they are able to destroy some of their largest ships. And because they don't have the industrial capacity that matches the United States, Japan cannot recover from that quickly. So the United States is now on the offensive, and they use a strategy called island hopping. So they move, I mean, it's in the name, but they move from island to island until they get in proximity of Japan, where they can set up an airstrip and bomb mainland Japan. So strategically, these islands are very important, but this is a strategy that is extremely costly to American lives, and it's not very fast. So the United States, for many, many reasons, decides to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we will talk a lot more about that in class. But prior to that, they had already been using bombing campaigns. For example, 100,000 people were killed in Tokyo because of fire bombings. So the total of people who are suffering because of this and dying because of this is just wild. 25% of buildings in Tokyo were destroyed. The atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, and on September 2nd, Japan surrenders. Why can't I spell surrender? All right, so they surrender. So this is the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is the greatest extent of um, the Japanese territory in 1944. The farthest advance, and this is where they were at in 1944 over here. So you can see like all these islands, the Americans are coming in, getting closer and closer to Japan. This is the Battle of Midway, an aerial shot from a U.S. bomber. And this is a kamikaze, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Kamikaze strategy was very mentally Mentally, it was like a big blow to the United States, but it was actually in the long term a larger blow to Japan because it was suicidal literally and figuratively because they were destroying these huge planes or these planes that took a long time to create and a lot of resources, and they were just like destroying them in one go. And a kamikaze wasn't going to be enough to sink a US aircraft carrier. I mean, it just wasn't possible. This is how the civilians were embedded into these islands. They were really hidden, and there was a lot of Japanese propaganda telling the Japanese people, that the Americans were going to they were cannibals, they were going to take their children, and some of this actually led to massive mass suicides on these islands, like people jumping off cliffs, Japanese people jumping off cliffs because they were so scared of what the Americans were going to do. The Americans tried to counteract that with their own propaganda, but it was not as effective. So there's Okinawa and there's Tokyo. Okay, this is the mushroom cloud from the atomic bomb. And this is Hiroshima after the atomic explosion. And we'll talk a lot more about these things in class. Okay, so in the next part of the video, we're going to get into the civilian costs. So this part is going to go over all of the different ways that civilians suffered in the war.